Well, hello everyone and welcome to a very exciting episode here on the MIgardener channel. Today we're going to be answering a very important question that is on the minds of all the gardeners, beginning and experienced, and that is, when should I be starting my seeds? I get this question a lot, and it comes up so frequently that I actually had to take some time to think about how I would present this in a way that would be informative, fun, and easy to understand all in the same. So I think I found it out and I'm ready now. It took me a while because it's just such a big topic and there's so many variables that often confuse beginning gardeners. And so I got it down to just the bare bones, and hopefully you all are gonna love it. So what we're gonna talk about today is what you should be starting indoors, when you should be starting it, and also kind of how you figure out kind of where you fall in what's called the last frost date. So there's a lot of different zones out there. You have down south, down by, the Gulf of Mexico, and then you have way far north like Minnesota and North Dakota and even Michigan way up there, So our climates are way different. And so I'm trying to make a video that's going to span across all the climates to touch all the gardeners, because where you are watching is probably not where I'm watching, where I would be watching when I watch this video. All right, so let's get into it. I'm already having fun. So the first thing I want to talk about is the fact that this is just for starting seeds indoors. We're also going to touch on what you should be starting outdoors and not start indoors. But I wanted to stress that oftentimes, and I'll make this point because it's extremely important, starting indoors is a luxury. And I've said this from the very beginning, that if you cannot start indoors, do not feel bad. If you don't have the space or you don't have the lighting, sometimes you're going to end up having a worse off garden starting indoors than had you just waited 3, 4, 5 weeks until the weather's warm enough to put a pot out on your patio and start them outdoors. And that's one thing that I want to get into the minds of everyone, is that if you can't, don't worry, because you're still going to have a long enough growing season. Here in Michigan, our growing season is about 150 days. And I say about because there's always variances. It's never going to be the same. But we have, on average, about 150 to 160 days in our growing period. And that's temperatures that are above freezing. And so what you want to do is you want to look at what you're growing. And let's say I'm growing a tomato that takes around 85 to 90 days to fully mature. If I took a seed, and let's say I was not able to start outdoors, if I took a seed and planted it in the ground, that seed is going to germinate and mature in about 85 to 90 days. And if I have 160 days in my growing period, I'm going to have roughly 70 days of that plant being fully mature and bearing loads of fruit. So if you can't, and what I'm saying by this before we get started is, if you can't start indoors, don't worry. I'm not one of those gardeners that says you're going to not have a successful garden or you're not going to be able to get a harvest, because trust me, you're going to get a harvest. One of the benefits though to starting indoors is you do get a head start. So I know a lot of gardeners want to do that. But the key is not starting too early and not starting too late. Because let's face it, if you start too early, the plant is going to start growing. And if you don't have adequate space to transplant up a pot size, or let's say the weather doesn't get warm for a little while and you have to keep the plants indoors, keeping them in a cramped space is going to get them very stressed out. And sometimes that can harm the plant. So starting too early is a bad thing. And then starting too late, it defeats the purpose of starting indoors. You'll still get a head start, but it really won't be as effective as it could be. So there's that very fine line of, that's the perfect time to start planting. So that's what we're going to talk about, that perfect time to start planting. So how do you know your perfect time? The first thing you're going to want to know is your last frost date. And how do I know where my last frost date is? If, Luke, you're in Michigan, your last frost date's nowhere near the same as us that live out in California that might only have 10 days of frost. By the way, I'm jealous. So how do you figure that out? Well, I have some resources for you. The first one is the Farmer's Almanac, and that's basically your go-to place for the rough averages for your first and last frost dates. And so you can look by city, and it's going to give you cities near you. It's not going to give you your city, especially if you live in a really small town, but it's going to give you a city nearby, and that's going to give you a rough estimate of when you should be starting. The next place is just by Google. Newer versions of Google, you can type right in a big city near you and just type in last frost date. For instance, us, it's last frost date in Detroit, Michigan, since that's the biggest town near us. And it's going to give you a rough estimate for that. And then third option is NOAA has a very good physical map. So if you don't like looking at city names, you can actually just know, hey, I live in the center of Michigan. Hey, I live in the thumb of Michigan. And then you can look at the map and say, okay, this is what the map is showing me. Since it's color coded, you can see when your first and or when your last frost date is, and the dates that kind of correlate with that. And that's again going to give you a rough average. And again, I will stress, it's never going to be perfect. And there's always that chance of a freak frost that'll come after that date and kill it. And there are a lot of times where if you follow that last frost date, the weather will be perfect to plant, but because you're following that last frost date, you might miss out on 2 or 3 weeks if the weather warms up sooner. So again, plant at your own risk, but that's going to give you the safest guide. And for beginners, I always suggest erring on the side of caution so you don't lose all your plants, because that can be very discouraging. So coming in close, I'm going to show you what to do next once you get that last frost date. All right, so what I've done is I've gone ahead and I've made a list, a pretty extensive list of all the things, or most of the things that a beginning gardener is going to want to start out in their garden. And again, this is not everything, but this gives you a very rough idea of kind of what you should be starting, when you should be starting it, and it goes through the majority of starting zones here. So there are things that you want to start like way over here in like the 8 to 11 weeks before your last frost date. But since those can be very difficult to start and they can be very confusing, we decided to X those and we stuck to no more than 5 weeks before your last frost date. So these are weeks before your last frost date, okay? So for instance, tomatoes, 4 to 5 weeks. Peppers, 4 to 5 weeks. Eggplants, 4 to 5 weeks. Things that are heavy yielding and take a lot of time to kind of get going, you want to start 4 to 5 weeks. The exception to that would be like celery and onions. They don't take a lot of time to get going, they just take a long time to mature. So like onions can take anywhere between 90 to 110 days. So I always start them indoors because that way I guarantee that they're going to be full size by the time they're ready to be harvested. Same thing with celery. Now let's move on to 2 to 3 weeks. 2 to 3 weeks would be things like lettuce, cabbage, broccoli, spinach, cucumbers, watermelon, and squash. And you're probably wondering, why cucumbers, watermelon, and squash in here? These are like leafing vegetables, and they're not super mature. They don't take a long time to mature, and they can be moved outside sooner. These are cold weather crops here, so you can move them outside in cooler weather, so you don't need to start them indoors that long. You don't need to start that far in advance. The reason why you want to start cucumbers, watermelon, and squash and things in those categories indoors only 2 to 3 weeks is because they get big and they start to vine. Oftentimes as gardeners, we find that we start these any sooner, you're going to have a jungle. And that jungle is going to choke out other plants, it's going to just take up sunlight because the leaves get really big, and it just gets to be a hassle. So start them 2 to 3 weeks and you're going to be just fine. Now direct sowing, this is very, very important. Oftentimes as gardeners, we want to start, our beets and our radishes and our corn and peas indoors. I've seen so many people doing that. Do not do that. Don't do that. I promise me you're not going to do it. Post in the comments box below and promise me you're not going to start any of these indoors. The reason why is because beets, carrots, radishes, and potatoes, those are all root vegetables. If you're harvesting them for their roots, they're not going to be transplanted out well because it's going to damage the roots, and if you're only growing it for the root, you don't want to damage it. The next thing you don't want to do is corn. Corn is a horrible one to transplant. Don't ask me why, but it's just a horrible one to transplant. Also, the reason why I highlighted corn and beans is because of the fact that you want to start them not as soon as you can. These you can actually sow, the ones that are unhighlighted, you can sow those as soon as the ground unthaws. As soon as you can work it and it's kind of in that safe zone for growing, you can actually start these. However, with corn and beans, you want to direct sow them, but direct sow them when the soil is above 50 degrees, when the soil is warm to the touch, because corn and beans will actually rot and mold if you put them in cool, damp soil. So you want to wait on those, but you do want to direct sow them. Do not start them indoors. So now that you have this list, kind of what you want to do is you want to say, okay, I'm starting tomatoes. Let's say I'm starting tomatoes indoors. How do I know what date should I start them on? Because I know they're 4 to 5 weeks. It's very, very simple. What you want to do is you want to take a calendar. And we take a calendar here. And obviously, we're in February now, but let's say your last frost date is April 20th. That's around where we put our plants outdoors. So let's say your last frost date is April 20th, and you want to start tomatoes that's 4 to 5 weeks before your last frost date. It's very simple. You just go 1, 2, and then 3, 4, 5. Very simple. Very, very simple. And that's going to give you around 4 to 5 weeks. So I would suggest starting your tomatoes on March 16th if your last frost date was April 20th, obviously. And the same thing goes for 2 to 3 weeks. Very simple. Oops, not May. Not May. So if it's April 20th, 2 to 3 weeks, 1, 2, you can start it at the latest April 6th, or if you want to go up, you can, you can start it on the 30th of March, and you're going to be just fine. This is totally fine to start it here. That is 2 to 3 weeks right there. So that's going to give you your rough start time. Again, if you don't start right on the 30th of March, you're not going to have a failed garden. You could even start it on the 29th of March, and you're going to be just fine. But it gives you a very accurate, kind of an accurate start time, so that you don't have an overgrown plant and you don't defeat the purpose of starting indoors, like we talked about. As you probably saw, I color-coded my start times. And you're probably wondering, why did you do that? Well, let's see here. I'm starting for our garden. I'm starting tomatoes, peppers, basil, onions, and celery. Then I'm also growing things like lettuce, cabbage, broccoli, spinach, cucumbers. Okay, I'm starting all of those. So why I color code is I can go back to my calendar here, and I will look at the color coding. Yellow, I obviously highlighted everything, which I shouldn't have done, but yellow. Okay, yellow is 4 to 5 weeks. I will say, okay, all right, so since I'm starting my seeds 4 to 5 weeks for yellow, that would be like all my tomatoes, I'm gonna highlight March 16th. And that kind of tells you, okay, I'm starting all of my peppers, tomatoes, basil, onions, and celery on this date. And it kind of gives you a little bit of key there. And then if I want to start, let's say, my orange stuff, which is all my 2 to 3 weeks, I'm going to highlight that date there. And then for blue, I save blue for the last frost date, because that's when I can direct sow all of the things, well, almost all the things that are direct sow required. See? So there you go. There's a super simple guide on what to plant and when to plant it. Hopefully you all enjoyed. Definitely give us a big thumbs up for getting it all done in one video. I did not think it was going to happen, but it did. So that's always surprising for me, because they usually end up being a little bit longer than expected, but I'm glad I got it done. Also, give us a big thumbs up for seed starting. It's just a great time of year, and it gets all of us excited, so thumbs up for that. Also, let us know in the comments box below what you are starting, if you are starting anything, and also make sure to share this video with those around you that are into the gardening mood, because it might help them out as well. Also, remember to subscribe. That also helps us out, because it lets us know that there's people to watch our videos when we upload them. And I'll talk to you all later. This is Luke from the MIgardener channel, and I'll talk to you all later. See ya. Bye.